This is the story of Kent Watkins. Kent is chairman of the American Academy of Housing and Communities, an honorary society of prestigious fellows who look at strategic issues from both the historical and futuristic in this sector. Although they take part in the issues of the day, they're also chartered to focus on the meaning of it all beyond the annual appropriations window. So while the rest of our COVID 19 series has been obtaining the daily problems and talking about this particular disaster, I have asked Kent to cast his mind's eye beyond that and give us some of his thoughts through history and imagination. So, first of all, Kent, what have you been doing during these last 5 months since we began hearing about COVID 19?
Well, thank you, Nan. First of all, I'd like to tell you how much I appreciate what you're doing with these podcast series. And I hope that the readers and viewers will get a lot out of it the way I have been doing. So thank you for all the work that you and your colleagues have been doing. Now, to your question, in December, I met with two Chinese delegations on behalf of the Academy with some of the fellows. And it was just by chance that it was the Shenzhen Health Commission first, and they're a large city now of about 12 million, and across from Hong Kong, and one of the key economic sectors for China, all of China. And we met with several groups from here involving natural disasters, but very little was said, if at all, that I can remember about the coming COVID-19. So the second group that came slightly after that was a group of emergency managers from Beijing who also talked about natural disasters with a group of medical Chinese American doctors from Hopkins and Harvard and NYU that I had put together for them. And a little more was talked about in that case, but mostly about earthquakes and hurricanes and fires. So, I can't look back and say, oh, I knew all about this, even though we were then meeting with some of the people involved in this field from China. Now, in January, I got some calls while I was down in Puerto Rico dealing with the earthquake and hurricane disasters down there, trying to find housing for artists under the FEMA and HUD programs. And I got some calls and emails from colleagues in China who said, can you get a hold of 100,000 masks and N95 masks and some, a few 100,000 medical gowns? And I thought, oh, yeah, right. Frankly, I didn't even at that point know much about that. But I said, well, I'll ask FEMA here in Puerto Rico if they happen to have anything in their warehouses. And almost jokingly said, I'll stop by the local CVS drugstore, pharmacy, and just see if I can pick up a few. Well, that was sort of my first inkling that things were starting to go out of the supply chain. I had to email back and said, nobody knows anything about it here. And if they did, they're not having any supply of what you're asking for. So that was that. And then, as we know now that China had told the WHO in, I think, January 2nd or 3rd, that something was happening in Wuhan. After the fact, of course, we also knew when they did the lockdown of Wuhan, a city of about 12 million also, that 5 million had already in a sense, escaped the blockade by going off to the rest of the world because of their spring festival or New Year festivities. So already we had a number of carriers that were landing in different cities around the world, including the US. At the same time, we also had a small cluster of cases happening in a nursing home in outside of Seattle, Washington. And that's about all I remember in January. I went on, as I said, down to Puerto Rico and back up to New York. We had an academy meeting with some of the HUD people on innovation. And I played my tennis tournaments and did my usual consulting, and probably everybody else was doing the same thing. February, we began to obviously get much more information, and in March, even more, as we began to hunker down or think about hunkering down, so that by April, I was already involving in a move from one apartment to the other, and said, well, I've got to go and get my hair cut beforehand because something is happening out there. And I went to the hair salon here in Bethesda, Maryland, and was sitting in the chair when the television was on. I wondered why they would be having it on, but they seemed to know more than I. And the governor, Hogan, of Maryland, came on at 11 o'clock and announced there would be a lockdown that evening and in the whole state. So I was ushered out after they finished my haircut, and I think I was the last, and we still don't have any open here yet. So I went home and finished, started my move. I had to get permission from the governor's office that it was an essential activity, and so the movers could come into the gated community where I live. And even though it was only 2 buildings away, it still took a day or so, because I had to negotiate also with the 2 condo associations involved, as it turned out, as to whether we could have a move in or move out. Everything was still pretty new at that time, so luckily I got by with it. After that, no more move-ins or move-outs. And of course, in New York City is an absolute, I think, clamp down on that. Now, during that time, of course, like everybody else, what did we do? Well, we were a little luckier here. There's a tennis court right next to me. So I was able to play, practice tennis with my daughter because families were allowed to play. And the moving took up a great deal of time, in 5,000 books having to be moved onto the new bookcases and reshelved, and everything else that is still a month later or more in a little bit of a chaos, as you know. So the academy meetings stopped, but we still then shifted to Zoom, and a lot of meetings involving the disaster consortium, recovery, involving getting more funds on the Hill for affordable housing and for the homeless, and all those other meetings that housing and other urban groups began to shift to. Of course, everything else, as you know, has been pretty much shut down, at least here in Maryland, DC, and Virginia, Northern Virginia. Now, just this week, we have a slight lifting of some of those restrictions. But in the meantime, what I did, to finish your question, was, besides what I just mentioned, begin to do a lot of reading about disasters in the past, whether it was literature. Shakespeare, of course, I learned most of his theaters, like Broadway in London, were closed down for 7 months at a time in between while he was writing plays because of the plague. I read about the Black Plague, of course. I read about the Athenian and the Roman plagues, and it all sounded a little familiar in terms of what some of the things they were doing and the politics, the political issues, along with the economic issues, of course. So that began to give me a background on up to reading, of course, some of books more modern, like Camus' The Plague, and Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Pale Horse being, of course, the fourth horseman of the apocalypse in Revelations. And Catherine Ann Porter used to live across the street from me in Georgetown. She also wrote that famous book called Ship of Fools. But she was then, when she wrote this book called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, a newspaper correspondent in Denver, and she had fallen in love with somebody, but she got the virus at that time, the 1918 influenza virus, gave it to her lover, who was then shipped overseas during the First War, as were hundreds of thousands of others who came down with the influenza, and he died. So this short novel was the story, which I had read years ago, but it made no impact on me until now. So that kind of Stephen King also had an interesting book, and the movie Contagion, which you've probably seen. So we sort of immersed ourselves in, oh yeah, this is a good time to do this sort of thing. But I also was trying to figure out, what did the Romans and the Athenians do? What was the medieval church doing, and the kings at that time? And what can we learn from them, if anything? So that's what I was doing.
Well, that's a lot. So, with all the things that you've read, how can we put COVID-19 into a larger or broader framework for our listeners to think about?
Well, I think that I would probably put it in several categories. And very briefly, the first one would be science, technology versus religion and myth, without being judgmental on either side, because we're still battling some of those same things today. And I don't care to bring up any ideological or judgmental kinds of things, rather than just simply point out that I think science and technology have moved further, but even in the time of Athens, you had Thucydides as the historian, who, by the way, had that particular virus, which nobody has yet agreed on. It may be have been typhus, it may have been Ebola in Athens, but what he wrote about were then the symptoms, and he also talked about the doctors and the physicians of of those days, who were also sacrificing their lives to deal with the people that were coming down with the symptoms and dying as quickly as we see them today, almost. And so I think that looking at how medicine and science and technology through the centuries continued to talk about data-based evidence and clinical trials, which we now have today. We also had on the other side the rulers and the people themselves, who got bored with the same kind of things that we had to deal with, which was lockdowns and wearing masks and social distancing. Now, they had much worse hygiene then, as you know, of waste flowing down the streets in the medieval towns, and other kinds of lack of good water. But they still were having the same kind of containment strategies, surprisingly enough. And they still, of course, had the desire, which is probably human nature, to just get outside after a while. They didn't want to stay cooped up. So they probably left before they should have, and then a second wave came, or another part of it, or mutated or something. So looking at San Francisco, for example, when they had their famous virus in, I think, not the earthquake, but a virus in about the same time, they also wore masks. They also had social distance. The same terms were being used. And they also got tired of it after about 6 weeks. Remember, quarantine originally meant 40 days. Now it's 14 days, and we use the same word. But in San Francisco, they said, oh, we've got to get out. And so the powers that be said, okay, and we need to get back to work. And then, of course, they got hit with another wave. And the trade-offs, I think, that we see are with us as we speak, which is, A, we get used to it, just as we've gotten used to the regular flu, in which, as was pointed out, and not without some logic at the time, well, look, we have still about 50,000 people who die of the regular influenza, partly because only about less than 50% get the vaccine, even now that we have the vaccine for the regular flu. And then you also have a group who don't want the vaccine, the anti-vaccine interest group. And so coupled with that, we now have some measles coming back. We now have, of course, this the level of flu deaths, regular flu deaths, and we have learned, I guess, to live with that. So we're going through somewhat that same kind of pattern, but now without a vaccine. So your guess is as good as mine as to what will be happening. So the second issue is the health, safety versus politics and power, part of which one person's freedom is an impingement on somebody else's freedom. So we're seeing a lot of that happen. Now, will we go back to the same kind of thing? Well, that sort of leads me to the third major issue in my mind, which is the whole relationship of cities to health. We have in the last few decades not been as concerned with connecting housing as much to health, other than nutritious meals under the Hope 6 program or other kinds of linkages like that. But it's been more of a linkage of housing to transportation now, and housing to education. And I think we need to get back, obviously, to thinking about health. We certainly have the sewer and water systems by and large, and waste management technology, but we may want to take another look at that. The problem we may have is now with robotics, in terms of technology innovation, only perhaps half of the persons will be coming back in the manufacturing that we do have. So that with social distancing, that will be necessary for a while, if not for a long time. 6 people usually being in the production plants who are 3 feet apart will now be 6 feet apart. Well, who will be in between? I think that robots will probably be taking, and already are taking, some of those jobs. So that's going to be a longer term problem, which it was going to happen anyway, and whether the pandemic will accelerate it is something I think we need to think about. I think that the telework that everybody is now doing, or much more, that the resistance of that is going to be lessened, or the desire to telework is going to be even more in demand, and many people are going to say, I don't want to go back to the same office. Now, some of them may say, get me out of here. I want to go back to the office. And there are arguments for both sides, depending on the kind of work. But I do think that for instance, how we plan cities in terms of greater density and the kind of structures that we build, such as office space, commercial space, may be severely impacted in the future. Something to think about as we further talk about what are we going to build around all these new transit stations that are going up, the Purple Line and the Silver Line here in the DC area. Denver with 70 new stations coming out of the ground, Phoenix with their stations and so forth, as well as the infill that's happening in Atlanta, San Francisco, and many other cities. Are we going to not want to have more density? Will there not be as much demand for it? We'll have to see. It depends on many other factors like the price of gasoline, for example. So anyway, I'd like to probably finish up.
Well, what I'm wondering is, you do have a lot of important things to say. And I wonder if we can't do a part 2 of this. So, because people like to listen, 15, 20 minutes at a time. And I think you have some things, I'd like to have some thoughts that you have on what the US and other nations in the world should be doing or thinking about, besides just the necessary day-to-day survival. So if we can draw this one to a close and we can do a part 2, I think that would work really well. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'd be delighted to.